2 Corinthians. And we left off very end of chapter 8. Let's see. And I did go ahead, and y'all, Miss Betty and Cody and Savannah, some of y'all there, let me know. I went ahead and combined these. Oh, you can't see that probably at all, can you? You can? Betty, you can see that? Kim, can you see it? Kent, can you? I was going to say, that seems like for me, that would be the younger eyes, I guess, could. But, yeah, that's, all right, I'll have to see if I can do anything with that, because what I did was I basically just took a screenshot of the little summary slide and then just 1, 2, 3, 4, put them together there. But that's smaller than I realized when I pulled it up on my screen. Of course, I'm like 2 feet from my screen, you know. In my office, it looked pretty okay, but that's small. But anyways, that's there's a summary of chapter 4. Chapters 1 through 4, and then of course 5 through 8. Which, like I said, I'll work on that. See if I don't know. I may just have to go back to doing quickly scrolling through the one slide at a time, because I don't know any way to. I could cut off top and bottom a little bit and gain some, but the sides is where it's going to be. I'm not going to be able to stretch it out much, so I don't know. We'll figure something out. But we left off with chapter 8, and as you can see there, if you can see it, the Macedonian churches used as an exhortation to give, an exhortation to follow through on the promised contribution, and the commendation of those sent to help prepare the collection. I mentioned this briefly last week, that, I think a couple of different times, that you have an example of Paul using, and Cleet Bulock and I have talked about this some, with the different forms of power, and a very interesting discussion that he has in one of his books that deals with different forms of power. He goes through 9 of them. And I want to do a lesson on this sometime, because they are forms of power that God uses with humans. And that if we want to be good leaders in family, in business, in church, and whatever, they're forms of power that we ought to use. And if they're used effectively, those are good leaders. Some people kind of do them naturally, but other people have to really, you got to think about it and make sure you're applying those things. But there are, if I can remember right, I think it's 5 that are freeing forms of power. It's 5 and 4, and I can't remember if it's 5 controlling forms of power or 4. But anyways, one set is controlling forms of power. The other set would be freeing forms of power. In other words, one of the most common controlling forms of power is reward. If you do this, here's what you're going to get. And also going right with that is punishment. If you don't do this, well, there are going to be consequences. But a freeing form of power, one of them would be, as he terms in his book, ego power. Because everybody wants to feel important. Everybody wants to feel like they're well thought of. At least normally, most people do. So Paul uses some of that here, and you see that where he's using these Macedonian churches as an example and saying, well, look at them. That's not the ego form, but he's leading into it with that. He uses those Macedonian churches. He says, look at them. They want to give. And then he's kind of, we looked at it a couple of different times, and even saw when he's talking about their obedience there at the end of chapter 7, where he says, I boasted to Titus about you and how, I know they're going to obey. I know they're going to do what they're supposed to do. And, he's just, sure enough, you've shown that my boasting was correct, and you've done the right thing here. But that's a use of what we might call that ego power, where he's saying, I believe you're going to do the right thing. You see this in Philemon, and it's kind of on my mind because I was discussing that some with Clete via email. But you see it again in chapter 8 where he's talking, show you to them, verse 24 of chapter 8, and before the churches, the proof of your love and of our boasting on your behalf. He says, look, we boasted to these other congregations how Corinth is going to step up to the plate and give, so y'all should too. And he says, now follow through so that we don't, we might use the expression in our day and age, so that I don't have egg on my face, because I've really bragged on you to them, how Corinth is going to step up, they're going to do this, so don't leave me hanging here. And I believe that you're going to do that. So, and you'll see it again a little bit in chapter 9 as well. But he's really telling them, I believe you're going to do exactly what you're supposed to do, what you need to do, because I believe you want to do the right thing. And again, you see this a lot in the book of Philemon where, I mean, you talk about, there's a lot of, what's the word I'm looking for? Diplomacy. Maybe that's the right word in the book of Philemon, because that's a touchy situation, right? I mean, here's a man who's got a runaway slave. No doubt he's going to be upset about that. It's never come out and stated, but it seems like his slave has stolen from him as he ran away. Then this slave, you talk about how life gets messy sometimes. This slave who's just a runaway criminal at that point, he somehow or another runs across this fella named Paul. And every time if you run across Paul, you're going to hear about Jesus. So he does, and his heart is pricked, and he ends up becoming a Christian. And now Paul has to have a hard conversation with him. Hey, Onesimus, the right thing to do is you got to go make this right. You got to go back home and make this right. And so here he goes. He says, but I'm going to write a letter to Philemon. And Onesimus carries that letter with him. But throughout that little short epistle, Paul is saying to Philemon, I don't have any doubt that this is not going to be an issue. You're going to do exactly as I'm recommending, because I know that's just the kind of guy you are. You are a faithful Christian, and this is what you're going to do. I don't have any doubts. So, it is interesting how, and we do that sometimes today. Sometimes there are people, and sometimes it's a situation, an occasion where we need to push a little bit and say, hey, do this, or here are some consequences, or do this, and here, you're going to attain this reward or whatever. But then there are times we need to say, build people up and say, I believe in you, and I believe you're going to do the right thing because you want to do the right thing. So again, we went through chapter 8. We saw this example of the Macedonian churches being exhorted to give. We talked about the background there, and the Macedonian saints, they gave freely beyond their ability, verse 3. The Macedonian saints begged to share in the fellowship, and they first gave themselves to the Lord, verse 5. Then we looked at the exhortation for Corinth to follow through. He's got got this example of the Macedonian churches. I'm just looking at this. I just realized I've got a literally went through this last week and never realized it. I said it a couple times a day. I didn't realize it, and I just now realized it. That's a typo. The Macedonian church, he's not exhorting the Macedonian churches to give. He's using them as an example of giving, and kind of saying he's using them to exhort the Corinthians to give. I don't know. I've read that so many times over the last few weeks, and I'm just sitting here going, wait a minute. Anyway, I'll try to remember to correct that before next week. But the exhortation part is for Corinth to follow through. But we talked about that. I just wanted to remind that because chapters 8 and 9 are so interconnected that I didn't want to just pick up, chapter 9, verse 1. Remember, a year previous, Corinth had the desire to participate in this contribution. They talked about it, and so he says, the time for planning, the time for talking is over. You got to step up and follow through with action. And it's not that he's, again, it's not that they are in disobedience at this point. He's not saying, man, I can't believe you guys, you promised to do this and you didn't. He's just saying, hey, it's been a year in the works, but now we're to the point where we're beyond planning and talking about it. We just got to, it's time to take up that collection. And again, he points out to them, we're accountable as stewards only for what we have, not for what we don't have. And then we looked at this illustration of godly giving. You have two illustrations. The middle one there is looking at some different biblical passages on giving. But the two illustrations basically are the Macedonian churches and the Messiah, Jesus. And so he talks about using those as examples, illustrations of godly or proper giving. And we talked about that more at length, so I won't spend much time on that slide. We talked about this one. I think we were kind of getting toward the end of class, but instructions concerning godly giving, it's personal, just as for each person. I can't say, well, you know what? I don't need to worry about giving because Robert's giving for me. Appreciate that, Brother Robert. He's just going to give extra for me. You can't do that. You can't say, well, my parents give for me or my spouse gives for me. Now, we understand if there's a family, a joint family, that's coming. But, I wouldn't sit there and say if I had two incomes in the family and say, well, she gives for us or he gives for us. It's individual. And as a family, it's looking at what all do we have? How much are we giving to the Lord, to his cause, to help his work? Godly giving has a purpose. It's not just, we've talked at length before about that, it's not just bankrolling money. Church is not a bank, it's not a savings and loan. It has a purpose. It's doing works of the church. It's not just, obviously you got to have funds to pay the power bill, to have climate-controlled facility, but it's not just for that. If that's what the majority of your budget's going for is upkeep of some facility, that's not a good thing. As I was using it for various purposes, but it has a purpose. And the number one purpose ought to be evangelism, outreach. And of course, you can use, I've seen congregations look for very creative ways to use even just the building. I've heard of a situation one time where there was a congregation, they did some kind of inward self-examination. They said, look, we're not involved in a ton of mission works. And they said, well, maybe that's something we want to look at. But one of the things that they decided to look at was the amount of money they were spending on their facility. They had shrunk in size a great deal, and so they weren't able to do a whole lot as far as massive support to missionaries. But they decided what we're going to start with is this building that, it was one of those situations where they were kind of at least relatively close to being what we would call inner city. And years ago, large membership, but just kind of changing of the makeup of the city. And maybe, I don't know, there could have been other reasons, poor leadership, who knows. But for whatever reason, they had shrunk down. So they decided, well, we still got this bigger facility, and we're paying for it. They paid it off, but power bill, light, water, and all that. How can we use this to be more evangelistic? That's a start, at least. And so they started looking for ways to use their building to be more evangelistic. But having a building just for the sake of having a building and that eating up tons of your budget, that's not a good thing. Godly giving is a privilege, grace, charis. We talked about that. It proves our love. We mentioned that. If you can look at what a person spends money on, you'll find out what they care about, whether it be hobbies or loved ones or whatever. It involves planning. Godly giving means we sit down and we plan it. It's not just, here comes the collection plate. Let me just see if I got something. Plan it out. And it needs to be something that we've given thought to. We've looking at our budget, looking at how much money's coming in, how much I'm going to give to the Lord's work, not a haphazard, spur-of-the-moment thing. It must be performed, and again, that's what he says there at the end of chapter 8, and that's kind of what this section is dealing with. There's a time for planning, there's a time for talking about it, and then there's a time to perform, do it. And that's what he says. Ultimately, you got to come through and give. There are prerequisites: giving oneself to God, verse 5 of chapter 8, and a willing mind, verse 12. And then, of course, it's provision. And the idea there is that when we give, God's going to take care of us. The old saying, you can't outgive God. Malachi 3:10 is the passage there where he says, "Prove me now herewith, says the Lord of hosts." He says, bring the tithes into the storehouse, and you just see. They were not, of course, tithes under the Old Testament. We understand that that was an Old Testament concept. In the New Testament, sometimes people ask that question, well, how much should I give if the tithe is not the law of the New Testament? Then, one of the things that I mention to folks is, and it's, when you look at your Old Testament, the tithe was a tithe of everything. It was a tenth of this, tenth of that, tenth of, whatever. But when you get to the New Testament, you don't see that tithing law. But what, the most you see is the widow who gave 100%, right? She gave everything. The least we see in the New Testament would be the 10%. So I always say I try to make my giving fall somewhere in between that. But the idea there in Malachi 3:10, he says, is you give as you should to the Lord and put his cause first in your giving. And he says, you just see. You just test me. Prove me. That's the idea. Test me, God says. And see if I don't open the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing, that there will not be room to receive it. And so that's the provision of godly giving. Same thing, Proverbs 3, 9 and 10. Honor the Lord with thy substance, the first fruits of all thine increase. There's the idea of the first fruits going to God. He says, so shall thy barns be filled with plenty, and thy presses burst out with new wine. So, in other words, again, you give God the first fruits. He said, God's going to take care of you. He's going to bless you. So, provision of godly giving. And then this is what we covered very quickly. But this is a section that is more self-explanatory anyways. This last little bit of chapter 8, 16 through 24, he talks about the care of Titus for them. He accepted the exhortation of his own, being more forward of his own accord. He went unto you, to the Corinthians. He says, we've sent with him the brother. This unnamed person, we don't know exactly who that is, but we do know his praise is in the gospel throughout all the churches. So he's well known and well regarded, we might say, among different congregations. And not that only, but who was also chosen of the churches to travel with us with this grace. So Paul, of course, there's wisdom. You're dealing with money, and probably going to be a significant amount of money. And so he says, we're going to send a brother who's well known, well regarded, and they're going to send multiple brethren. So there's accountability there. But he says this is the person that the congregations chose. It's not Paul's hand-picked person. Of course, Paul knows there's this anti-Paul faction there at Corinth, so he's smarter than that, because they would love to say, oh, well, Paul, you got your yes man to go and take that money so that you could get your cut from it. No, he says, you all chose this fellow, not me. Then he goes on, where did I leave off? Verse 19, chosen of the churches, traveled us with this grace, which is administered by us to the glory of the same Lord and declaration of your ready mind. Avoiding this, that no man should blame us in this abundance which is administered by us, providing for honest things not only in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of men. Well, God knows when we're honest and we're dishonest, but he says we want to make sure that even in the sight of men, everything's open and above board. Transparency here in dealing with this money. And he says, and we have sent with them our brother, again unnamed, not sure who this is, whom we have oftentimes proved diligent in many things, but now much more diligent upon the great confidence which I have in you. Whether any do inquire of Titus, verse 23, he is my partner and fellow helper concerning you. Or our brethren be inquired of, they are the messengers of the churches and the glory of Christ. Wherefore, show you to them before the churches the proof of your love and of our boasting on your behalf. So here are these people, they're going to come to Corinth. He says they're chosen by the congregations, the churches. It seems to be a reference to the Macedonian churches because that's where this has been coming from previously. But it could be others. But he says, not my hand-picked guy, Paul says. These are chosen by the brethren, the churches. They're coming. They're well regarded. They're faithful. And they're going to be gathering this contribution to take it on to Jerusalem to the saints. Treat them well. Have the contribution ready so that it's not a big drawn-out thing trying to gather this up. It's just a matter of if they come, they get it, and they're on their way. So, again, we talked about this section, but very quickly, you have this respected brother, verses 18 and 19, who was sent. A third diligent brother, verse 22. Paul's going to do everything honestly, and that's kind of what this whole section is about, is him making sure he lays the cards on the table and shows them everything's being done very transparently. Because, there were always those at Corinth that wanted to get on Paul and criticize Paul, that faction. And then we kind of, in closing, last week mentioned these three brethren were messengers. Apostolos is the Greek word there, of the congregations. And I just mentioned that just to say that sometimes that word is used very specifically, such as Paul, the apostle. And sometimes that word is used very generically. So sometimes people will look at, in fact, I've had young people come to me before because maybe they went, and it could be in college, it could be some kind of youth event or something. They say, this guy was reading, he was talking about these other apostles. And he pointed out, and he's like, did you know that in the Greek, this place, this guy's called an apostle. Over here is a woman, and she's called an apostle. And it's like all of a sudden they're just like blowing their mind on what have I always been taught about, women can't take on that leadership role, but here's a woman apostle. Apostolos. The Greek word means sent one, messenger. It sometimes denotes a specific office. It's much like another word that continues to this day, diakonos, which means deacon. That's one meaning. It also means servant. It is sometimes used simply, in fact, you talk about taking some liberty with the biblical text, and it's one of the reasons why some of the modern translations really frustrate me, because there's one of them, I can't remember, maybe the NIV, that in Romans 16 it talks about Phoebe and calls her a deaconess of the church at Rome. She was no deaconess. Did you know what she was? She was a servant. And that's what we all ought to be. Would to God that Paul or somebody else writing of any given member of this congregation, that they would write and say, that brother, that sister is a servant of the church at Bremen.
So if someone mentioned that, they were a deaconess, and you said, so how would you explain that to them? Just go back to the meaning of the word?
Yeah, I would just look at the Greek word is used, diakonos is used extensively throughout the New Testament, and it far more often just means a servant. Sometimes it means a special servant. And obviously in 1 Timothy 3, starts giving special qualifications. He's obviously talking about a special servant there. And you see it in Philippians 1:1 where he mentions bishops or elders and deacons. But yeah, that's how I've looked at that before with people. And, there are qualifications for a deacon that wouldn't work for a woman. In fact, I think that's was trying to think. I know with an elder, it mentions specifically husband and one wife. I was trying to remember, does it say that? With a deacon as well, I think it might. Let me just double check. It mentions in verse 11, 12, let the deacons be the husbands of one wife. So, well, Phoebe's going to have a hard time with that one. Ruling their children in their own house as well. And then what I was going to mention in verse 11, what seems to be a reference to the elders and the deacons. And this is what we sometimes forget. There are elders, there are qualifications to be an elder, to serve as an elder. There are qualifications to serve as a deacon. There are also qualifications for their wives. And there's not as much said on those, but there are qualifications given. One of those being verse 11, or a few of those, grave. In other words, not just everything's a big joke. And they know how to be serious about serious matters. It's not to say that they don't have a sense of humor or can't have fun. Not slanderers. Sober-minded, and faithful in all things. But again, just by giving qualifications there for wives, that tells us whether you're talking elders or deacons, these are men. But yeah, apostolos, diakonos, those are generic words that are sometimes used in a much more specific way, but they're also often used in a generic way. Apostolos meaning a sent one, or we sometimes say messengers, and that's what he says here. It's translated. I meant to look. Somebody got a New King James? Is it messengers there as well? Verse 23. It is messengers. So, that's probably the best translation there. Messengers. These are messengers of the churches. All right, now, so to get into chapter 9, which is kind of the conclusion and goes well with this, you've got just two sections, plea for Corinth to have the collection ready before Paul comes. First 5 verses, mentioned that already. He says, hey, we've talked about it, we've planned. These brethren are coming that were chosen by the churches, so when they get there, have it ready. So it's just a matter of quickly getting that together and getting it on to Jerusalem. And then the last section, 6 through 15, he's just pointing out that God loves and blesses a cheerful giver. And so that's really chapter 9 in a nutshell. These first 5 verses have the contribution ready. He says, as touching the ministering to the saints, it is superfluous to me, for me to write to you. In other words, we've covered this. I don't have to cover this all over again. And he says, for I know the forwardness of your mind. Here again seems to be kind of some of that ego power. He says, look, I know you want to do this, for which I boast of you to them of Macedonia, that Achaia was ready a year ago, and your zeal hath provoked very many. He said, listen, man, I've been bragging on y'all. I told them that. Listen, y'all need to get with this because Achaia, Corinth, that's the bigger region for Corinth, they were ready a year ago. And he says, listen, your zeal in this, man, you've fired up some other congregations, and now they've gotten involved in this contribution. He's bragging on them. Yet have I sent the brethren, lest our boasting of you should be in vain in this behalf, that, as I said, ye may be ready. He says, I'm sending this letter to let you know it's going to get there, Lord willing, before the brethren do, so you can be ready. Lest haply, if they of Macedonia come with me and find you unprepared, we, that we say not ye, should be ashamed in this same confident boasting. Well, how awkward would that be if all this boasting I've had, and then we get there in Corinth, it's like, we need to talk, we need to have a meeting about this, we need to talk about this. He says, no. It's time to follow through. Therefore, I thought it necessary to exhort the brethren that they would go before unto you and make up beforehand your bounty, whereof you had noticed before, that the same might be ready as a matter of bounty and not as of covetousness. Well, we're not coming there and trying to snatch money out of your hand, out of your tightly clenched fist. There used to be I can't remember if it was somebody that said this, but sometimes you'll still see the T-shirts or the bumper stickers or something, they can have my guns when they pry them from my cold, dead fingers. Well, that's kind of what Paul says here. We don't want this to be a matter of having to come and pry this contribution from your cold, dead fingers, this death grip that you've got on your money. It's supposed to be something that is willing, and it's a matter of bounty. He says also, that idea of not, of it being a matter of bounty. He says it's not a matter of putting you in the poorhouse to help others. Giving should be, there is a sacrificial element to giving, but he says it's not that we're trying to say, well, you should just do without to help these brethren. But it's a matter of sharing, fellowship, especially because this is going to help fellow Christians. So that's that idea there. So here you have this, it's a continuation of chapter 8 regarding the contribution. They had pledged their help a year before. Saw that in verse 2. Paul bragged on them, used their zeal to stir up the Macedonian saints, and it had apparently worked. It did so because he got good help from Macedonia. He sent some brethren on to Corinth to help get things ready. He wants to come to Corinth. He says later on, I guess it depends on how you read that, and we'll talk about that when we get to it in chapter 12 or chapter 13. He wants to come. He's not, I think, and again, we'll talk about it when we get there, but as I understand it, I think he's saying he hopes to, but he's not sure how things are going to play out, we would say. Some people say he says, I am coming, but I think it seems to me like he's saying, well, this is what I want to do, but we'll see how things go. Again, proper giving involves preparation. It involves generosity. You see that in verses 3 and 5. The preparation, being ready. Verse 5, again, that idea of bounty, not covetousness. It's generosity. It's not prying it away from somebody. Covetousness, that's the reference to covetousness. But it's somebody willingly giving to the Lord and, of course, to others. So the plea to have that contribution ready. Then, this second section, God loves and blesses a cheerful giver. So he picks up in verse 6 and just, right on the heels of saying, have it ready as a matter of bounty, not as of covetousness. But as I say, he which soweth sparingly shall reap also sparingly. And he which soweth bountifully shall reap also bountifully. Every man according as he purposeth in his heart, and there's your planning. It's not just haphazard. Every man according as he purposeth in his heart, so let him give, not grudgingly, and there's not a matter of covetousness, as he said earlier, not grudgingly or of necessity, not because somebody's standing over you going, come on, give. But, or he says, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loveth a cheerful giver. And God is able to make all grace abound toward you, that ye always having all sufficiency in all things may abound to every good work. And then he quotes from the Old Testament, as it is written, he hath dispersed abroad, he hath given to the poor, his righteousness remaineth forever. Now he that ministereth seed to the sower, both minister bread for your food, and multiply your seed sown and increase the fruits of your righteousness. In other words, God's going to take care of you. You give, and we already noticed that in those passages in Malachi and Proverbs, you give helping others generously, from a good heart, a pure heart. And he says God's going to make sure you're provided for. It doesn't mean we're going to be just, filthy rich, but he's going to take care of our needs, right? And sometimes people mistake that. You get this idea like Joel Osteen and this prosperity gospel. If you're not prosperous, just give more, and God's going to make sure you got, all these riches. No, God never promised that, but he promised he'll take care of your needs. And we sometimes mistake wants for needs. But he goes on in verse 11, being enriched in everything to all bountifulness, which causeth through us thanksgiving to God. For the administration of this service, again, this service being the contribution, not only supplied the want of the saints, the lack of the saints, what they want or will lack, but is abundant also by many thanksgivings unto God. Whilst by the experiment of this ministration they glorify God for your professed subjection unto the gospel of Christ, and for your liberal distribution unto them and unto all men. And by their prayer for you, which long after you for the exceeding grace of God in you. And he closes the chapter with, thanks be unto God for his unspeakable gift. New King James has there, indescribable gift. So when you talk about giving, well, how can you talk about giving without talking about the one who gave everything, more than we could ever give or think to give, because he literally had everything. But he gave that up to come to this earth and to die for us. And so he uses that. He says that's a motivation for us to give. At least it should be. The sowing and reaping in our giving is mentioned in verse 6. And it reminds us of Galatians 6:7, right? Well, what does he say there? Be not deceived. God is not mocked. Whatsoever man soweth, that shall he also reap. Of course, he goes on to say, if you sow to the Spirit, you'll love the Spirit, reap life everlasting. If you sow to the flesh, you'll love the flesh, reap corruption or destruction. The giving that pleases God, we already pointed out, it's purposed, but it's also, here we learn from verse 7, it's also willing. That's the type of giving that pleases God. So if I'm sitting there, as the old saying goes, squeezing that dollar bill so tight that the president squeals, then that's not willing giving, is it? If I'm kind of like, they're watching me. I know everybody's. That's not. Or if I'm sitting here thinking, well, if I don't give, the elders are going to come and talk to me. It's willing. That's the kind of giving that pleases God. And the kind of giving that pleases God is, again, not haphazard, not just spur of the moment. Here we're to the collection part of the worship, and I got to get. And now, look, we've all been there where, I forgot maybe I forgot to write out the check or whatever. But I'm talking about somebody that's not giving any thought to it. And whenever possible, have the check already written out and be ready. So it's not just a scramble or whatever. That's the idea, though, is thinking about this, thinking about, okay, what do I have? What can I give to the Lord? It's giving some forethought into it. I was just barely 19 years old. I started preaching school right before I turned 19, so that was very end of August. So you had September, October, November, somewhere in December of that year, I think it was. I was still, pretty early in my schooling, so I wasn't going out and doing a lot of preaching at little small area churches like we did a lot later on in our schooling. I was still basically attending it's Forest Hill, but back then it was still Knight Arnold in Memphis. The elders, it may have been more like November, but they passed out these sheets one night. I want to say it was a Sunday night to the congregation, or may have been a Sunday morning. And they asked on there, it was 2 or 3 things regarding giving. But one of the things that they asked was, they asked members if you would put down what you plan to give, weekly, or some people do bi-weekly by how they get paid, or maybe even monthly. They said, look, and there was a note there. It's very clear. We're not saying this is, what you are constrained to give every single Lord's Day. This is just helping us to budget, to plan. I was a 19-year-old kid, and I'd never seen that before, and I thought to myself, that's not a bad idea. But there was like several people in the congregation. It was not like a majority or anything, but there were some that got so bent out of shape over that. I cannot believe. And I'm like, in fact, I was talking to somebody about it one time. It was one of the younger adults. And somehow or another we got talking about it. And I wasn't being a smart aleck or anything. I was just sort of confused because, I was, again, 19-year-old kid that never lived outside of Cleveland County, Alabama. So I was having a lot of eye-opening experiences in that first year or so living in Memphis, Tennessee, coming out of the west side of Memphis, Tennessee, coming out of Heflin, Alabama. But I made a statement, something to the effect of, well, it seems to me that what they're wanting here is just purposed giving, which is what Paul talks about in 1 or 2 Corinthians 9. And it wasn't like the elders got up and announced, if you don't turn that in, expect some discipline from the congregation. Nobody said that. They didn't say, in fact, they were very clear, quite the opposite, but nobody said, we're going to look at your contribution every single Lord's Day, and if it drops a penny below that, you can expect us to be on your doorstep. It was nothing like that. It was just, hey, could you help us as we plan our budget? And one of the reasons for that particular congregation is because they were and are the home of the Memphis School of Preaching. A lot of students go to Memphis. I was one of them. They don't have all their support raised. And you know what they tell you every single time? Come on. We'll work that out. We'll help you. We'll try to get that raised. But in the meantime, they help cover you. That church, that congregation, gives to the tune of about $300,000 to $500,000 a year out of their budget to the preaching school. So, you can see where it would do good to have an idea of what your people are going to give. But I was just so blown away by that as a young man, as a young Christian, because it just seemed to me, it was like, I read 2 Corinthians 9:7, and I'm like, this is a good idea. It's not a bad thing at all. But some people were just acting like it was just so, what are they doing? So anyway, purposed giving. Think it through. What can I do? And maybe even sit down from time to time, year to year. Could I possibly do more? It may even be that I could do something separate. Sometimes I've known a lot of people. I've done it for myself. I try to do this when I get a tax refund. I try to take a decent chunk of that, and can I help a missionary? Can I help a kid go to Bible camp? But what could I do with that? And that's something that can be even separate. And I may send that to an overseeing eldership for that particular missionary, or sometimes I'll even do it through Bremen, and that way it's coming from the Bremen church. But just purposed giving, willing, cheerful, not just gritting my teeth the whole time, but doing it because I want to help others, because I want to please God. And of course, giving that pleases God will always result in a blessing for the giver. God is able to make all grace abound towards you. That's why Acts 20:35, quoting Jesus, Paul says, it's better to give than to receive. Because there's a blessing in that for the giver. Obviously, there's a blessing in that for the receiver, but there is an even greater blessing to be had quite often for the giver. So when these congregations sent funds to help their needy, poor brethren in Judea, verse 12 tells us they supplied the needs of those brethren. Verse 12 also tells us they caused thanksgiving. Those brethren were giving thanks to God because of your contribution, Paul says. They glorified God. You sent this help, and it helped them, and it caused them to give thanks to God. They were thankful to their brethren, but they also glorified God. Look, God has come through for us, and He's helped us because here we are, we're in need, and our brethren contributed to help us out. And verse 14 points out, it effected a closer relationship between the givers and the receivers. Sometimes people talk about when a missionary comes and reports, and sometimes people will say something like, maybe I don't enjoy that as much, or I wish we were, maybe not. But I was just sitting here thinking, it may not be anybody who says, I wish we were having a sermon that night. But some people do. They say, well, I wish we were having a sermon or doing a study. Sometimes people even make a statement like that. Well, it's not that I don't mind that. I just, whatever. But here's my thing. And I've even said this, maybe perhaps to some of you. I enjoy those because, well, one thing, it gives me a Sunday night off. But number two, I enjoy those because that's something that as a person who gives to the Bremen church, I'm helping with Brother Graham's work in Scotland, Brother Ferguson's work in South Pacific Islands, and all these different mission works that we support. If you give to the Bremen church, you're helping with those. And so when he stands up and they talk about the work that's going on, I'm sitting there thinking, I'm a part of that. And I may not ever meet those people this side of heaven, but one day in heaven, how neat will that be to say, They can come up and talk to us, and we say, hey, we supported that work. And you may have somebody that says, hey, I'm here partially because of what you did and how you gave. So there's a closer relationship between the giver and the receiver that is affected through the giving. And I love that about hearing about different mission works. We get a lot of mission reports, and I would encourage you, go to the bulletin board here in the hallway and check those out. GBN and the different works that are supported, you're a part of that. If you are a contributing member of the Bremen Church of Christ, you're helping support those. And so I love hearing about the work that they're doing and the stewardship that's being displayed. I really, really enjoy that. And there's a blessing and a closer relationship. And I love getting to spend, even if it's just a little bit of time with those guys when they come in to give those reports and to talk to them and get some encouragement from them about the work that they're doing, because it brings closeness. And so that's what giving does when we give. I know we're about to have a second bell, so I'll go ahead and mention, give you the kind of the breakdown here of chapter 10. This is another one. We only got 2 sections. The Christian's warfare in Christ, verses 1 through 6, and then Paul's authority, his work, contrasted with his opposers, verses 7 through 18. And this is where you're really going to see Paul get into defending his apostleship and dealing with some of that anti-Paul faction. He's really, really going to get where the rubber meets the road, as we say. All right, so we'll stop there and we'll pick up and take on chapter 10, Lord willing, next week. And for now, we will have a break between our worship and Bible study, or Bible study and worship. Thank y'all.